Introduction of the protagonist. The late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, painting the streets of the small town with streaks of amber and gold. Angela Carter, a proud and spirited black woman in her early 30s, made her way home from a long day at the community health center where she worked as a volunteer nurse. Her modest bag swung gently at her side as she strolled down the quiet street, her mind preoccupied with the thought of a warm dinner and the upcoming weekend with her niece, who had begged her to teach her how to braid hair. Angela had always been someone who looked for the good in people. Her life hadn't been easy. She had faced her share of prejudice, whispers behind her back, and sometimes outright hostility, but she had never let it dim her compassion. Her mother's words echoed in her mind whenever she faced injustice. Kindness and courage are our sharpest weapons. Angela, fight with them, and you'll never lose. As she passed by the corner bakery, the familiar sound of laughter from inside made her smile. It was a small community, one where everyone seemed to know each other. But tonight, the air felt different, tense, charged with something unspoken. That's when she saw it. The confrontation with firefighters. Ahead, a column of black smoke rose into the twilight sky. Her pace quickened, her nurse's instincts kicking in. She rounded the corner to find chaos, flames engulfing an old apartment building, their orange tongues licking hungrily at the crumbling facade. Firefighters swarmed the scene, their bright yellow uniforms cutting through the haze like beacons of order amidst the destruction. A crowd had gathered, their murmurs blending into the crackling roar of the fire. Angela scanned the faces in the crowd, frightened parents clutching their children, elders pointing in hushed tones, but no one seemed to be stepping forward. She caught sight of an elderly woman on the curb, coughing violently, and a young boy clinging to her side, his eyes wide with fear. Without hesitation, Angela approached the scene, her voice steady. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" The old woman nodded, struggling to catch her breath. Angela knelt beside her, rummaging in her bag for the small first aid kit she always carried. She handed the boy a bottle of water and began coaching the woman through breathing exercises. It was then that she felt the weight of a shadow looming over her. She looked up to find a firefighter towering above her, his face obscured by his helmet but his stance bristling with authority. "Hey," he barked, his voice sharp and dismissive. "What are you doing here? This is no place for a bystander." Angela stood, keeping her tone calm but firm. "I'm just helping her. She seemed," I said. He interrupted, stepping closer. "Get back, we don't need your help." Angela blinked, taken aback by the aggression in his tone. "I wasn't trying to interfere. I'm a nurse. I just wanted." Before she could finish, another firefighter joined him, and then another, their expressions cold and disdainful. One of them smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, a nurse, huh? Why don't you go play doctor somewhere else?" The crowd began to murmur, the tension thickening like the smoke in the air. Angela felt the heat of humiliation rising in her chest. But she stood her ground. "I have every right to be here," she said evenly. "If you're not going to help her, someone has to." That was when it happened. One of the firefighters stepped forward, holding a hose. Without warning, he turned it on, blasting Angela with an icy torrent of water. The force knocked her back, soaking her clothes and hair, and she stumbled to the ground. Gasps erupted from the crowd, some shouting in protest, others too stunned to react. Angela struggled to her feet, her dignity bruised but not broken. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. "This is assault." The firefighter laughed, joined by his companions. "You wanted to help, didn't you? Here's your help." The humiliation was unbearable, but Angela refused to back down. She locked eyes with the man who had sprayed her, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You think this makes you strong?" she said, her voice low but cutting. "It doesn't. It makes you a coward." Reactions from witnesses. The crowd, previously frozen in shock, began to stir. A man stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Hey, what the hell's wrong with you?" he shouted at the firefighters. A young woman pulled out her phone, recording the scene. Others joined in, their voices growing louder, angrier. The firefighters seemed caught off guard by the shift in the crowd. They exchanged nervous glances but didn't back down, their arrogance blinding them to the growing fury around them. Angela, soaked and trembling, turned to the crowd. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice ringing clear above the commotion. This is about all of us. If we let this happen, if we let them treat people like this, what kind of world are we building for our children? Her words struck a chord. People began to nod, their murmurs turning into shouts of agreement. Someone in the crowd yelled, "We're with you." The firefighters retreated, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the collective outrage. But the damage had been done, and the flames in the apartment building seemed almost symbolic of the fire ignited in the hearts of those who had witnessed the injustice. As Angela stood there, drenched but unbroken, she realized that this was only the beginning. The community had seen the truth, and they wouldn't let it be buried. The rhythm of Angela Carter's footsteps on the cracked sidewalk mirrored the gentle hum of the town's evening. She was a woman of quiet strength, forged by years of navigating a world that often overlooked her. Her dedication to her work, her community, and her family had earned her the respect of many. But she also knew respect was not always enough to shield against prejudice. Still, she walked with her head held high, as the scent of baked bread from the corner shop gave way to the acrid smell of burning wood. Angela froze. The smoke curled ominously in the distance, its thickness cutting against the serene backdrop of her neighborhood. Her instincts flared. This wasn't just a bonfire or someone grilling in their backyard. Something was wrong. Her pace quickened, worry tightening in her chest. She wasn't one to shy away from helping others, it was practically ingrained in her. Her late mother had always reminded her, "Angela, if you see someone in need, you don't look away, you step forward, always forward." The scene of chaos. Turning the corner, Angela was met with the sight of an inferno raging against the night. The apartment building wasn't just on fire, it was being consumed. Flames licked hungrily at the windows. Smoke billowed like an angry storm cloud, and the crackling roar of the fire was punctuated by the shouts of firefighters barking commands. Angela's eyes darted across the scene, taking it all in. A young woman sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her baby. An elderly couple stood helplessly on the curb, their hands trembling as they leaned on each other for support. But it was the sight of a boy, no older than 10, standing barefoot in the street and clutching a ragged teddy bear. That pierced her heart. She moved without thinking, weaving through the crowd until she reached him. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly, kneeling to his level. "Where's your family? Are you hurt?" The boy shook his head, his wide eyes reflecting the fire. "My grandma's coughing really bad. She can't walk good. I don't know what to do." Angela stood, scanning the chaotic scene. Near the boy, an elderly woman was hunched over, wheezing and clutching her chest. Her frail frame shook with each labored breath. Angela's medical training kicked in. "It's okay," Angela assured him, her voice calm and steady. "I'm going to help her. And I'll stay with you, too." The confrontation expanded. Angela knelt beside the elderly woman, her hands moving quickly but gently. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I need you to try to take slow, deep breaths." She pulled out a small bottle of water from her bag, offering it to her. But before she could do more, a gruff voice sliced through the air. "What the hell are you doing here?" Angela looked up to see a firefighter looming over her, his uniform darkened by soot. His stance was imposing, but what struck her was the coldness in his tone. "She's having trouble breathing," Angela explained, keeping her voice calm. "I'm just trying to. I didn't ask for an explanation," he snapped, stepping closer. "You need to back off and let us do our job." Angela frowned, standing her ground. "I understand you're busy, but this woman needs immediate attention. And I can help. I'm a nurse." The firefighter's eyes narrowed, his lip curling in disdain. "I don't care what you are. We don't need you here. Get out of the way." Angela's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. "If you're not going to help her, then I will. She's in distress." And another firefighter joined the first, his smirk adding a layer of mockery to the exchange. "Looks like we've got a hero here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe she thinks she can put out the fire herself." The crowd was starting to pay attention now, their murmurs growing louder. Angela felt their eyes on her, but she refused to be intimidated. "This isn't about me," she said firmly, her gaze locking onto the first firefighter. "It's about her. And every second you waste arguing with me is another second she's struggling to breathe." It was then that the second firefighter made his move. With a flick of his wrist, he turned on the hose he was holding, directing the freezing spray directly at Angela. The force of the water hit her like a truck, knocking her to the ground. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Angela scrambled to push herself up. water streaming from her hair and clothes. "What are you doing?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Are you insane?" another voice called out. But the firefighters only laughed. "She wanted to help," one of them jeered, "so we're helping her cool off." Angela's body shook, both from the cold and the fury building inside her. She stood slowly, her soaked clothes clinging to her, her fists clenched. "Is this what makes you feel powerful?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Humiliating someone who's just trying to help." Her words struck a chord. The laughter faltered. The crowd's murmurs turned into angry shouts. The crowd reacts. "Hey, leave her alone," a man yelled. Stepping forward, he was tall, broad-shouldered, and his voice carried the weight of authority. "She wasn't doing anything wrong." A young woman raised her phone, recording the scene. "This is disgusting," she said loudly. "You think you can get away with this?" More voices joined in, a chorus of anger and outrage. "You can't treat her like that. We saw everything. This isn't right." The firefighters exchanged uneasy glances. The crowd was growing louder, more unified. What had started as murmurs of discontent was now a wall of defiance. Angela turned to face the crowd, her body still trembling but her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me," she said, her words cutting through the chaos. "This is about every person who's ever been told they're less than. Every person who's been silenced, pushed aside, or humiliated just for standing up for what's right. Are we going to let them keep doing this?" "No," someone shouted. "We're with you," another voice called. The firefighters began to back away, their arrogance dissolving in the face of the crowd's fury. But Angela knew this was far from over. The battle had only just begun. As she stood there, drenched but unbroken, she felt a surge of determination. The flames consuming the building weren't the only fire burning that night. A new fire had been lit in the hearts of those who had witnessed the injustice, and it was one that wouldn't be extinguished. Angela's determination amid chaos. The crowd's murmurs and shouts were growing, but Angela's focus remained razor-sharp. Her soaked clothes clung to her skin, her breath hitched from the icy blast of the fire hose. But her spirit remained unbroken. She wasn't going to let herself be reduced to a victim. Not in front of these men, and certainly not in front of her community. The elderly woman she had tried to help was still struggling to breathe, clutching her chest as the boy hovered beside her, tears streaking his soot-stained face. Angela forced herself to move, ignoring the water dripping from her hair and the ache in her muscles. She knelt once more beside the woman, shielding her with her body from any further attacks. "I'm here," Angela whispered softly, pulling out a spare towel from her bag to wrap around the woman's shoulders. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on. You don't know when to quit, do you?" sneered the firefighter who had sprayed her. His smirk was fading now, replaced by a flicker of unease as the crowd's energy shifted. Angela didn't respond to him. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, directly into the lens of the young woman's phone, which was still recording. The silent defiance in her eyes spoke volumes. "The crowd takes a stand." "Stop it," shouted an older man near the front of the crowd. His voice rang with authority, and heads turned toward him. He was Mr. Jefferson, the local barber who'd been a respected figure in the community for decades. "You think you can treat her like this just because you're wearing that uniform? You're supposed to protect people." More voices joined in. A middle-aged woman yelled. "She was helping. We all saw it. You don't get to decide who matters and who doesn't," a teenager added. Her phone raised high as she live-streamed the scene. The firefighters hesitated, their bravado cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. They had expected submission, silence, things they'd gotten away with in the past. Instead, they were met with a wall of anger and solidarity. One firefighter, clearly uneasy, muttered, "Maybe we should." "Shut it," barked the leader, the man who had first confronted Angela. His face was twisted with rage, but there was fear in his eyes now. "We're in control here, not them." But control was slipping from their grasp. The crowd was no longer just murmuring. They were advancing, slowly, deliberately, forming a protective ring around Angela and the elderly woman. Angela's defiant stand. Angela rose to her feet, drenched but dignified, and turned to address the crowd. Her voice, though tired, carried strength. "This isn't just about me," she said, her words cutting through the rising noise. "It's about all of us. About every time we've been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to know our place. Well, this is my place, right here. Standing up for what's right." And it's your place too. The crowd roared in agreement. You see that? Angela said, turning her gaze back to the firefighters. Her voice grew sharper, each word a blade. You don't scare me. You don't scare us. We're not going to let you bully us, humiliate us, or silence us anymore. The leader's face turned beet red. He pointed a gloved hand at Angela. You've got no idea who you're messing with. No, Angela replied, stepping forward until she was mere feet from him. You've got no idea who you're messing with. And neither does the world. But they're about to find out. Escalation and tension. The tension in the air was electric. The firefighters looked around, their confidence unraveling as more phones appeared in the crowd, recording every word, every action. The power dynamics were shifting, and they could feel it slipping through their fingers. Desperate to regain control, one of the firefighters turned the hose on the crowd. The icy spray hit the front line of bystanders. But instead of scattering, they stood their ground. A young man in a hoodie shielded an elderly woman, while another group linked arms, refusing to back down. You're going to pay for this, someone shouted, their voice fierce. We're done being quiet, yelled another. Angela moved to shield the elderly woman and the boy again, her own body trembling with adrenaline. She looked at the firefighter holding the hose and called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. That's your best move? Attacking people who can't fight back? If this is what you call strength, then you don't deserve that uniform. Her words struck a chord, not just with the crowd, but even with some of the firefighters. A younger man in the group hesitated, lowering his head as guilt crept into his expression. A turning point. The fire continued to rage behind them, its flames now reflecting the burning outrage in the hearts of the community. The crowd pressed forward, their collective anger transforming into something more powerful, solidarity. We need to call the station, someone in the crowd suggested. Forget that, another voice responded. We'll take this to the press. Let everyone see what they've done. Angela locked eyes with the firefighter leader one last time, her gaze unwavering. You've lost tonight, she said simply. You don't even know it yet, but you've already lost. The aftermath of the encounter. As the fire truck's sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of more crews, the initial group of firefighters began to withdraw. The leader barked at his team to pack up, his face dark with humiliation and fury. The crowd didn't cheer or jeer. They simply stood their ground, united and unyielding. Angela turned back to the elderly woman and the boy. Let's get you somewhere safe, she said gently, helping the woman to her feet. The boy clung to her arm, his wide eyes now filled with admiration instead of fear. As they walked away, Angela glanced over her shoulder at the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude. They had stood with her when it mattered most. She knew this was only the beginning, but in that moment, she felt the first flicker of hope. The world might have tried to silence her, but tonight, her voice had been louder than the flames the morning after. A city awakens. The next morning, the sun rose over a town that had changed overnight. Smoke from the burned apartment building still lingered faintly in the air, a grim reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. But it wasn't the fire that people were talking about. It was Angela Carter. Angela awoke to find her phone buzzing incessantly. Messages poured in, friends, colleagues, neighbors, all wanting to check on her, to offer their support, and to share the viral videos of the confrontation. Overnight, the footage of the firefighters' assault and Angela's defiant stand had spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with outrage, solidarity, and calls for justice. But Angela wasn't celebrating. Her body ached from the force of the fire hose, and the humiliation of the previous night still clung to her like a second skin. She sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through her phone with a mixture of disbelief and dread. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she found Mr. Jefferson, the barber who had stood up for her the night before. Behind him were half a dozen neighbors, their faces solemn but determined. Angela, Mr. Jefferson said, his voice steady. We need to talk. We're not letting this go. A community rises. Angela found herself seated at the center of a circle in Mr. Jefferson's barber shop. Surrounded by familiar faces, people from all walks of life had gathered, teachers, parents, small business owners, even teenagers who had been recording the incident on their phones. This ain't just about you, Angela, Mr. Jefferson began, his voice thick with emotion. What they did to you last night, that was an attack on all of us. And we can't just let it slide. Heads nodded around the room. Angela looked at their faces, some weary, some angry, but all resolute. "I didn't ask for this," Angela said softly, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to become a symbol or a martyr. I just wanted to help." "And you did," said a woman named Maria, a local schoolteacher. "You showed us what it means to stand up, even when it's hard. Now it's our turn to stand with you." The group began brainstorming ways to take action. They talked about organizing protests, contacting local journalists, and filing formal complaints against the fire department. Angela listened in silence, overwhelmed by their passion but unsure if she had the strength to lead them. "Angela," Mr. Jefferson said, his eyes locking onto hers, "you've already done the hardest part. You stood up, now let us do the rest." The media takes notice. By the afternoon, reporters had descended on the neighborhood. News vans lined the streets, their antennas stretching toward the sky like eager fingers. Angela tried to avoid them, slipping out the back door of her home whenever possible. But it was no use. Her face had become the centerpiece of a movement she hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. One journalist, a young black woman named Simone Hayes, managed to catch Angela on her way to the store. "Angela," Simone said, her tone gentle but insistent, "I'm not here to sensationalize what happened to you. I'm here because your story matters. People need to hear it, from you, not just from the videos." Angela hesitated, her fingers tightening around the straps of her bag. "I'm not sure I have anything new to say. You stood up when they tried to silence you," Simone said, her eyes earnest. "That's not just a story, it's a call to action. Let me help you tell it." After a long pause, Angela nodded. "Okay," she said quietly, "but only if this stays about the community, not just me." That evening, Simone's story went live. It was raw, powerful, and unflinching, detailing the events of the fire, the firefighters' actions, and the community's response. Angela's name trended on social media within hours, accompanied by hashtags demanding justice and accountability. Pressure on the fire department. The fire department's initial response was dismissive. A curt statement claimed that Angela had interfered with their operation and that the use of the hose was a necessary measure to ensure safety. But as more videos surfaced, their narrative unraveled. The community organized a protest outside the fire station. Hundreds gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Angela," "Protect, Don't Attack," and "End Racist Violence." Angela stood at the front of the crowd, her heart pounding as she stepped up to the microphone. "I didn't come here to be a hero," she began, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "I came because I saw someone who needed help. That's what I've spent my whole life doing, helping people. But last night, I was shown that there are people who see my skin before they see my humanity. And I'm not the only one. This fight isn't just about me. It's about every single person who's ever been told they don't matter. Well, we matter, and we're not going anywhere." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. Angela felt a wave of emotion crash over her: fear, pride, hope, but most of all, determination. The legal battle begins. Behind the scenes, lawyers from a local civil rights organization had taken up Angela's case. They filed a lawsuit against the fire department, citing abuse of power, assault, and discrimination. The case quickly gained traction, drawing support from national organizations and activists. The firefighters involved tried to mount a defense, claiming that Angela had been disruptive and that their actions were justified. But the video evidence was damning. It showed not just their aggression but also their mockery, their blatant disregard for Angela's dignity. The legal battle was grueling, dragging on for weeks. Angela was called to testify, her hands shaking as she recounted the events of that night. But she refused to let the fear consume her. Each time she stepped into the courtroom, she carried with her the voices of her community, the chants from the protests, and the belief that justice was worth fighting for. A movement takes root. As the trial continued, the movement grew. What had started as a local effort to seek justice for Angela became a nationwide conversation about systemic racism in emergency services. People shared their own stories of discrimination and abuse, creating a groundswell of solidarity and demand for change. Angela found herself at the center of it all. She was invited to speak at rallies, to meet with lawmakers, and to appear on national television. Each time, she spoke not just about her own experience but about the broader issues that had been exposed. "This isn't just about me," she said during one interview. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." It's about accountability, about humanity, about building a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Her words resonated deeply, sparking initiatives in other cities to address racism in public services. The verdict. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. The firefighters were found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. The department was ordered to pay significant damages, not just to Angela but to the community as a whole, funding programs for diversity training and community outreach. As the verdict was announced, Angela felt a wave of relief but also a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a longer fight for justice and equality. The aftermath begins. Angela's neighborhood, usually so quiet, was alive with a restless energy. The events of the previous night had ignited something that couldn't be contained. People who had remained passive in the face of injustice for years were now speaking out, their voices carrying the weight of shared pain and solidarity. Angela sat in her small kitchen, nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the counter. The notifications an unrelenting stream of solidarity and outrage. Messages poured in from strangers thanking her for her courage, from friends offering their support, and from journalists hungry for her side of the story. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor, holding a basket of muffins. "Angela, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I saw what they did to you. I had to come by and tell you how proud we are of you." Angela blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you," she whispered. "And don't you worry," Mrs. Patterson added, her tone firm. "They're not getting away with this. Not if we have anything to say about it." A community mobilizes. That evening, Angela attended a hastily organized meeting at the community center. The room was packed, the air buzzing with determination. People of all ages and backgrounds had come together, united by a shared sense of purpose. "We've had enough," Mr. Jefferson declared, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. "What happened to Angela is just the latest in a long line of abuses. We've been pushed around, ignored, and disrespected for too long. It ends now." The room erupted into applause. Angela, sitting quietly near the back, felt a mix of pride and trepidation. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than that. Maria, the schoolteacher, stepped forward with a clipboard. "We need to be organized," she said. "We're going to file formal complaints, contact the media, and start a petition demanding accountability. But we also need to plan a protest, something that shows them we're not backing down." Ideas flew around the room, each one building on the last. By the end of the night, they had a plan. A peaceful march to the fire department, followed by a rally at City Hall. Angela tried to speak, to voice her fears about becoming the face of the movement. But Mr. Jefferson caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod. "Sometimes, Angela," he said softly, "the fight chooses us." The protest, a show of strength. The morning of the protest dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that felt like a promise. Angela stood at the front of the march, her heart pounding as she looked out over the sea of people behind her. They carried signs with messages like, "Justice for Angela," and "Racism has no place here." As the march began, chants filled the air. "No justice, no peace, protect, don't attack, stand with Angela." Angela felt a lump rise in her throat as she walked, her hands gripping the banner she held with Mr. Jefferson and Maria. She had never seen her community like this, so united, so fearless. When they reached the fire department, the crowd came to a halt. Angela stepped forward, trembling slightly as she approached the microphone set up on the makeshift stage. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "It's about every person who's been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced because of the color of their skin. It's about holding people accountable, no matter what uniform they wear. And it's about saying, loudly and clearly, that we will not accept hate in our community." The crowd roared its approval, their cheers echoing off the buildings. Angela felt the weight of their support behind her, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Backlash and threats. As the movement gained momentum, the backlash began. Anonymous letters filled with hateful words appeared in Angela's mailbox. Her phone rang late at night, the caller hanging up as soon as she answered. And then there were the online comments, cruel and venomous, questioning her motives and attacking her character. You knew this would happen. Simone Hayes, the journalist who had first interviewed Angela, told her over coffee one afternoon. When people see their power threatened, they lash out. But why me? Angela asked, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I'm just one person. I didn't ask for any of this. Exactly, Simone said. You didn't ask for it. And that's why you're so powerful. They see you standing up. And it terrifies them. But you're not alone in this. Simone's words stayed with Angela as the threats continued. Instead of retreating, she leaned on her community. Each letter of hate was met with a card of support from someone in her neighborhood. Each anonymous call was balanced by a neighbor stopping by to check on her. The fear didn't disappear, but it became something she could bear. A turning point in the media. As the videos of the incident continued to circulate, national news outlets picked up the story. Angela was invited to appear on a morning talk show, where she shared her experience with a mix of vulnerability and determination. This isn't just my fight, she said, her voice steady. It's a fight for every person who's ever been told they're less than. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. The interview struck a chord, sparking a wave of support from activists, politicians, and everyday people. Donations poured in to support the legal case against the fire department. And organizations began calling for reform in emergency services nationwide. The legal battle heats up. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Angela sat beside her lawyers, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The firefighters' defense tried to paint her as a disruptive bystander. But the videos told a different story. The turning point came when a firefighter who hadn't been involved in the incident testified on Angela's behalf. What they did was wrong, he said, his voice breaking. They didn't just fail Angela, they failed all of us. The courtroom was silent as the weight of his words settled over everyone present. Angela felt a spark of hope. Justice was finally within reach. A movement solidifies. Outside the courtroom, the community continued to rally. Angela found herself at the center of a growing movement, one that reached far beyond her town. She spoke at rallies, wrote op-eds, and met with lawmakers, using her platform to push for meaningful change. This isn't about vengeance, she said at one rally. It's about accountability. It's about making sure that when someone puts on a uniform, they're there to serve and protect, not to harm. The crowd erupted into applause, their chants rising into the night sky. Angela felt a deep sense of purpose. This fight had chosen her, but she was ready to see it through Angela's solitude, strength found in the quiet. After the march, Angela returned home to an unfamiliar silence. The roar of the crowd, the chants, and the applause had filled her with purpose. But now, in the dim light of her modest living room, she felt the weight of the battle ahead. She sat on her couch, her legs folded beneath her, and stared at the flyers and news articles spread across her coffee table. The headlines screamed her name, calling her a hero, a symbol, a warrior. But Angela didn't feel like any of those things. She felt like a woman who had stumbled into a fight she didn't know how to win. She buried her face in her hands, breathing deeply to steady the storm in her chest. A knock on the door broke through her thoughts. When she opened it, she found the young boy from the fire, clutching his teddy bear. Behind him stood his grandmother, frail but standing tall, her cane trembling slightly in her hand. "We wanted to say thank you," the boy said, his voice small but earnest. Angela knelt to his level, her eyes brimming with tears. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," the grandmother interjected, her voice firm. "Not anyone would have done what you did. You stayed when others turned away. You stood up when others stayed silent. And because of you, we're here. That matters." Mounting pressure on the fire department. The fire department's headquarters, a red-bricked building that once stood as a symbol of safety, now bore the weight of public scrutiny. Protesters gathered daily, their chants demanding accountability echoing through the streets. Signs reading, "Justice for Angela," and "End Racism in Uniform," lined the sidewalks. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Fire Chief David Warren, a man who had built his career on maintaining the department's pristine reputation, paced his office, his face flushed with frustration. He had hoped the controversy would blow over. But the movement had grown too big to ignore. "They filed formal complaints against us," his deputy informed him, tossing a thick folder onto the desk. "And the city council is asking questions. This isn't going away." Chief Warren's jaw tightened. What about the firefighters involved? They're doubling down, claiming they did nothing wrong. Then we're all going to pay for their arrogance. Warren muttered, slamming his fist onto the desk. Get me their reports. I want every detail. If they think I'm going to go down protecting them, they've got another thing coming. Angela faces unexpected allies. Not everyone in the fire department supported the actions of the firefighters involved. A young firefighter named Ethan, who had watched the events unfold from the sidelines, decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He reached out to Angela through a mutual connection, asking to meet her in a neutral location. When they met in a quiet coffee shop, Angela was cautious. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone wary. Ethan looked down at his coffee cup, guilt written all over his face. "Because what they did was wrong. And I can't live with myself if I don't say something." Angela studied him, her expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you stop them?" "I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to stand up to them. But watching you stand up, it made me realize I don't have an excuse. I want to help, if you'll let me." His sincerity caught Angela off guard. She had expected defensiveness or self-justification, not this quiet vulnerability. "If you're serious about helping," she said after a moment, "then tell the truth, publicly." Ethan nodded, determination hardening his features. "I will." A betrayal within the department. Ethan's decision to speak out sent shockwaves through the fire department. His testimony, combined with the video evidence, painted a damning picture of the culture within the department, a culture of complicity, where silence was encouraged and dissent punished. The firefighters involved in Angela's assault lashed out, accusing Ethan of betrayal. They spread rumors, attempting to discredit him, but it was too late. Ethan's words carried weight, and his courage inspired others to come forward. A veteran firefighter named Linda, who had served for over 2 decades, also broke her silence. She detailed instances of racism and misconduct she had witnessed during her career, adding fuel to the growing fire. "I stayed silent for too long," Linda said during a televised interview. But watching what happened to Angela, it was a wake-up call. This department needs to change. And it starts with accountability. The community fights back. Angela's community was no longer just her neighborhood. The movement had spread to other cities, where people organized their own protests and marches in solidarity. Stories of discrimination in emergency services began surfacing nationwide, each one adding to the urgency of Angela's fight. The community center became a hub of activity, with volunteers working tirelessly to organize events, draft petitions, and raise funds for the legal battle. Angela, though reluctant to take the spotlight, found herself at the heart of it all. One evening, as she prepared to speak at a town hall meeting, Maria pulled her aside. "You're doing amazing, Angela," Maria said, her voice warm. Angela shook her head. "I'm just trying to keep up. This feels so much bigger than me." "It is bigger than you," Maria agreed, "but that's the point. You've given people something to believe in. Don't underestimate what that means." The legal battle intensifies. The lawsuit against the fire department gained momentum as more evidence came to light. The firefighters involved had attempted to downplay their actions, but their own arrogance proved their undoing. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from Ethan, who provided internal emails and messages that revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior within the department. In court, Angela faced her attackers with quiet strength. She recounted the events of that night in vivid detail, her voice steady despite the weight of her memories. The firefighters' lawyers attempted to discredit her, suggesting she had been disruptive and interfering. But Angela's composure and the overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. The turning point came when the elderly woman Angela had helped testified. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Angela saved me. And those men attacked her for it. She didn't deserve that. No one does." A community transformed. As the trial continued, the community around Angela grew stronger. Neighbors who had once been strangers now worked together, united by a shared sense of purpose. Small businesses displayed signs of support in their windows. Schools organized educational programs on racism, and local artists created murals honoring Angela's courage. One mural, painted on the side of the community center, depicted Angela standing tall, her head held high, surrounded by flames that transformed into a phoenix rising. Beneath it were the words, "From the ashes, we rise." Angela saw it for the first time after a long day in court. She stood in front of it, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. The moment of truth, the day the verdict was announced. The courtroom was packed. Angela sat between her lawyers, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge's voice was steady as he read the decision. The firefighters were found guilty of misconduct and discrimination. The department was ordered to pay significant damages, and sweeping reforms were mandated. Cheers erupted outside the courthouse, where hundreds had gathered to await the news. Angela stepped out to address them, her voice carrying the weight of the journey they had all taken together. "This victory isn't just mine," she said, "it's ours, and it's proof that when we stand together, we can make the world better, not just for us, but for the generations to come." The crowd roared, their voices a symphony of hope and determination. Angela felt the weight of the fight lift, replaced by a new sense of purpose. The trial. A day in court. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Angela Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly, her heart pounding as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The past months had been grueling, endless depositions, media scrutiny, and the ceaseless weight of the community's hopes resting on her shoulders. But she hadn't fought alone, and that thought steadied her. The evidence presented in the case had been overwhelming. Videos of the assault, testimonies from witnesses, and damning statements from brave insiders like Ethan and Linda had painted a vivid picture of systemic misconduct. The firefighters' lawyers had tried to frame Angela as a troublemaker, but each attempt had crumbled under the truth. As the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, Angela's mind drifted briefly to the moments that had brought her here. The humiliation of the fire hose, the tear-filled faces in the crowd, and the voices that had risen in unison, refusing to let her stand alone. "The court finds the defendants guilty," the judge declared, his voice steady. The actions taken by the firefighters on the night in question were not only unprofessional but discriminatory, abusive, and in direct violation of the public trust. The courtroom erupted into a mix of cheers and tears. Angela felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the understanding that this victory, while monumental, was just one step in a much larger fight. The verdict's aftermath. Outside the courthouse, a sea of supporters waited, their signs held high: "Justice for Angela," "End racism in uniform," and "No more silence." When Angela emerged, they erupted into cheers, their collective voice a tidal wave of triumph. Angela stepped up to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted it. "Today, we've shown what happens when a community stands together," she began, her voice strong despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. "This verdict is more than just justice for me, it's a message. A message to every person who's been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated. You are not alone. And when we fight together, we win." The crowd's roar filled the air, and Angela felt a wave of warmth wash over her. She glanced at Mr. Jefferson, Maria, and the boy whose life she had saved that fateful night. They nodded at her, their pride evident. Reparations and reforms. The financial penalties imposed on the fire department were significant, but Angela insisted that the money go beyond compensating her personally. A portion of the damages was used to establish the Angela Carter Community Fund, aimed at supporting victims of discrimination and funding diversity training programs for public servants. The court also mandated sweeping reforms within the fire department. These included mandatory anti-racism training, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and the dismissal of those directly involved in Angela's assault. The reforms sparked conversations across the nation, inspiring similar initiatives in other cities. But the changes didn't come without resistance. Some within the department and the community pushed back, claiming the reforms were unnecessary or excessive. Angela faced renewed criticism and even threats, but she stood firm, bolstered by the unwavering support of her community. Angela's rise as a symbol. In the months that followed, Angela became a national figure, a reluctant but effective leader in the fight against systemic racism. She was invited to speak at universities, community events, and national conferences. Each time, she shared her story with humility and conviction, always emphasizing the collective power of the people who had stood beside her. "This isn't about me," she said during a televised interview. "It's about all of us. It's about the kind of world we want to live in and the kind of future we want to build." I never set out to be a symbol. But if my story can inspire someone else to stand up, then it's worth it." Her words resonated far and wide. Movements in other cities began to adopt her approach, using personal stories to galvanize support for systemic change. Angela's face appeared on magazine covers. Her name became synonymous with courage, and her actions inspired a new generation of activists. Personal challenges and growth. Despite her public success, Angela struggled with the personal toll of her journey. The trauma of that night still haunted her. Flashes of the icy blast from the hose, the mocking laughter of the firefighters, and the weight of humiliation in front of her community. She sought therapy, learning to process her pain and channel it into her advocacy work. Her friendships deepened during this time. Maria and Mr. Jefferson became her closest confidants, their unwavering support a constant source of strength. Even Ethan, the young firefighter who had testified against his colleagues, became an unexpected ally. "You taught me what courage looks like," he told her during one of their conversations. "I hope I can live up to it." Angela smiled, the weight on her heart lifting slightly. "Courage isn't about being fearless," she said. "It's about standing up even when you're scared. And you've already done that." The ripple effect. Angela's fight sparked a ripple effect across the nation. Stories of others who had faced discrimination began to surface, each one adding to the growing momentum for change. Advocacy groups sprang up in cities and towns, using Angela's case as a blueprint for action. One of the most impactful moments came when a group of young activists approached Angela with a proposal to create a national coalition against racism in public services. They wanted her to serve as its honorary chair. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like this," Angela said, her voice tinged with doubt. "Angela," one of the activists replied, "you've already changed the world. Now it's time to make sure that change lasts." Legacy solidified. Years later, Angela stood before a crowd of thousands at the unveiling of a monument in her honor. The sculpture depicted her standing tall, her face resolute, surrounded by figures representing the diverse community that had supported her. The plaque beneath the monument read, "In honor of Angela Carter and the community that stood with her." A reminder that justice is a collective effort and that courage, even in the face of fear, can change the world. As Angela looked out over the crowd, she saw familiar faces: Mr. Jefferson, Maria, Ethan, the boy she had saved, now a young man. She also saw strangers, people who had been inspired by her story and had come to honor her journey. "I didn't do this alone," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This monument isn't just for me. It's for every person who stood up, who spoke out, who refused to let hate win. This is our legacy. And it's only the beginning. A new chapter." As the event ended and the crowd began to disperse, Angela lingered at the base of the monument, her hand resting on the cool stone. A young girl approached her, clutching a notebook. "Miss Carter?" the girl asked shyly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Angela said, kneeling to her level. "How'd I be brave like you?" Angela smiled, her heart swelling. "Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared," she said. "It means you care about something enough to stand up for it. Even when you are. And you've already taken the first step by asking the question." As the girl beamed and ran back to her family, Angela felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her fight wasn't over, but she had helped light a fire that would burn long after she was gone. And in that moment, she knew her mother had been right all along. Kindness and courage were the sharpest weapons of all. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom buzzed with tension on the final day of the trial. Angela Carter, clad in a modest yet resolute outfit, walked in with her head high. The weeks of testimony had laid bare the systemic rot within the fire department. The firefighters involved in her assault sat across the aisle, their expressions ranging from defiance to unease. The prosecution's final argument was devastating. Videos of the incident, corroborated by witness testimonies, painted a damning picture. Ethan and Linda's statements, combined with internal emails revealing a culture of racism and misconduct, left no room for doubt. The defense clung to their narrative that Angela had interfered with a dangerous operation. But it unraveled under the weight of evidence. Ethan's tearful testimony about the pressure to remain silent was particularly powerful. "I was afraid to speak out," he said, "but Angela's courage showed me that fear is no excuse. What happened to her was wrong. And it's time we start making it right." Angela was called to the stand for her closing testimony. The courtroom held its breath as she spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't want to be here," she began, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't want to become the face of this fight. But the truth is, this isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows people like those firefighters to abuse their power without consequences. It's about the people they've silenced before me, and the people they would have silenced after. This isn't just my fight, it's all of ours. And I will not let it be in vain." The verdict and its impact. When the judge announced the guilty verdict, the courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and tears. Outside, the crowd of supporters, who had been waiting anxiously, broke into jubilant applause. The firefighters were found guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and discrimination. The penalties were severe. The firefighters involved were dismissed, their certifications revoked. The fire department was ordered to pay reparations and undergo mandatory reforms, including anti-racism training, community oversight, and a complete overhaul of their leadership. For Angela, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but it couldn't erase the pain of that night. Yet, as she stepped outside to address the cheering crowd, she felt a flicker of hope. "This victory isn't just mine," she told them, her voice carrying over the sea of faces. "It belongs to all of you who stood with me. It belongs to every person who's ever been told they're less than. Every community that's been dismissed or silenced. Today, we showed the world that together, we are unstoppable." The legacy begins. In the weeks following the trial, Angela's life changed dramatically. The national spotlight turned toward her, with invitations pouring in for interviews, speeches, and panels. Her story inspired movements across the country, each one demanding accountability in public services. Angela worked tirelessly with her community to establish the Angela Carter Justice Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to combating racism and abuse of power in public institutions. The initiative focused on advocacy, supporting victims of discrimination in filing complaints and lawsuits, education, hosting workshops and training programs for public servants, policy reform, lobbying for systemic changes in laws governing emergency services. The initiative quickly gained traction, with chapters springing up in cities nationwide. Angela traveled extensively, meeting with other activists, policymakers, and community leaders. Despite her growing fame, Angela remained grounded. She spent her evenings at the community center, helping organize local events and mentoring young activists. "This fight started here," she often said, "and it's here that I feel the most at home." Resistance and resilience. Not everyone celebrated Angela's rise. Conservative pundits and online trolls accused her of playing the victim or destroying traditions. Some within her town remained hostile, claiming the trial had tarnished their reputation. Threatening letters occasionally arrived at her doorstep, and her public appearances were sometimes met with hecklers. But Angela refused to back down. She saw each act of resistance as a reminder of why her fight was necessary. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a town hall meeting. A man stood up, his voice dripping with hostility, and shouted, "People like you are tearing this country apart." Angela paused, letting his words hang in the air before responding. "No," she said calmly. "People like me are trying to build a country where everyone matters. A country where justice isn't just a word but a reality. If that frightens you, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." Her words were met with thunderous applause, drowning out the man's protests. A symbol for a generation, Angela's story became a beacon for a generation searching for justice. Young activists, inspired by her courage, began organizing their own protests and initiatives. Universities invited her to speak, and her memoir, Standing in the Fire, became a bestseller. The memoir delved deeply into her journey, from the night of the fire to the courtroom and beyond. It wasn't just a recounting of events, it was a manifesto for change, calling on readers to challenge injustice wherever they found it. One of the most poignant passages read, "Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up when you're terrified, about speaking when your voice shakes. I was scared that night, and I'm still scared sometimes. But I've learned that fear is just another fire. And if you stand long enough, you can walk through it and come out stronger on the other side." The monument and the future. Years later, Angela stood before a monument dedicated to her and the movement she had inspired. The sculpture depicted her standing tall, her hand outstretched as if reaching for the future. surrounded by figures representing the diverse community that had stood with her. The unveiling ceremony was attended by thousands, including dignitaries, activists, and everyday people who had been touched by her story. Angela's speech that day was short but powerful. "This monument isn't just for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's for everyone who's ever stood up, spoken out, or refused to let injustice win. It's a reminder that change is possible. But it's also a call to action. The fight isn't over. It never is. But as long as we stand together, we can build a better world." A legacy of hope. In her later years, Angela continued to advocate for justice, though she passed the reins of her organization to a new generation of leaders. She found joy in quieter moments, mentoring young activists, spending time with her community, and reflecting on the journey that had defined her life. Her story became part of the national curriculum, taught in schools as an example of resilience and the power of community. Students wrote essays about her, drew pictures of the monument, and organized projects inspired by her work. Angela's legacy was not just a statue or a book. It was a movement, a living, breathing force for good that continued to grow long after her story began. And though she had never sought to become a hero, Angela Carter's name would forever be synonymous with courage, justice, and the unyielding power of the human spirit. The verdict ripples beyond the courtroom. The courtroom verdict marked a historic moment, but the reverberations were far from over. The news spread like wildfire, appearing on national headlines and dominating social media. For many, Angela Carter had become more than a name. She was a symbol of resilience, a spark that ignited a larger conversation about systemic racism and abuse of power. Angela returned home that evening to find her porch filled with flowers, cards, and candles. People she had never met stopped by to leave notes of gratitude and support. Her community, which had stood by her throughout the trial, now celebrated her victory as their own. Yet, Angela couldn't shake the weight of what came next. As she sat on her porch, watching the candles flicker in the dark, Maria joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You did it," Maria said, handing Angela a cup. "We did it," Angela corrected, "but the fight's not over." "Maria, you know that." Maria nodded, her expression serious. "The system doesn't change overnight. But you've shown people that it can change. That's more than most can say." A movement grows. Within days of the verdict, Angela found herself inundated with requests for interviews, speeches, and panel discussions. Activists from across the country reached out, eager to learn from her experience and apply it to their own communities. Angela realized that what had started as a personal fight for justice had grown into something far larger, a nationwide movement for accountability and equality. She began traveling to cities where similar cases of injustice had been buried under bureaucracy and silence. In Chicago, she stood with the family of a man who had died in police custody, demanding transparency. In Atlanta, she addressed a rally of healthcare workers pushing for equitable treatment. And in Los Angeles, she met with young activists who were inspired by her story to tackle systemic bias in education. Each city presented new challenges, but Angela's presence brought unity and hope. Her speeches, heartfelt and unpolished, resonated deeply because they came from a place of lived experience. "Change doesn't happen because one person stands up," she told a crowd in Detroit. "It happens because 1,000 people see that one person and say, if they can stand, so can I, and together, we don't just stand, we move mountains." The pushback, an unrelenting storm. As Angela's prominence grew, so did the resistance. Conservative commentators accused her of fomenting division, while anonymous threats began to flood her inbox. At one rally, a protester disrupted her speech, yelling, "Why don't you let the past go?" Angela paused, her gaze steady as she addressed the heckler directly. "The past isn't gone," she said, her voice firm but calm. "It's here, in the systems that treat some lives as worth less than others. Ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. Facing it, fixing it, that's how we let it go." The crowd erupted in applause, drowning out the heckler. But the moment lingered in Angela's mind. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Still, the threats took a toll. One evening, after receiving a particularly graphic letter, Angela confided in Ethan, the young firefighter who had testified on her behalf. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for me." But for the people who believe in this, what if I let them down? Ethan shook his head. You've done the hardest part. Angela, you've shown people what's possible. The rest of us, we'll carry it forward. You're not alone in this. A turning point, the Angela Carter Act. The culmination of Angela's advocacy came with the introduction of the Angela Carter Act, a federal bill aimed at addressing systemic bias in public services. The act proposed mandatory diversity training, independent oversight committees, and strict penalties for misconduct among emergency service personnel. Angela was invited to testify before Congress, a moment she approached with both trepidation and determination. Dressed in a simple suit, she spoke with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the trial. This isn't just about me, she told the panel. It's about every person who's been failed by the very systems meant to protect them. It's about making sure no one has to stand where I stood, alone, afraid, and treated as less than human. We have the power to change that. The question is, do we have the will? Her testimony sparked fierce debate, but it also galvanized support. Grassroots campaigns across the country rallied behind the bill, flooding lawmakers' offices with calls and letters. When the act passed months later, it was hailed as a landmark victory for civil rights. The monument, a community's tribute. Back in Angela's hometown, plans were underway for a permanent tribute to her and the movement she had inspired. Local artists collaborated to design a monument that would capture the spirit of resilience and unity that had defined their fight. The unveiling ceremony drew thousands of attendees, including activists, politicians, and everyday people whose lives had been touched by Angela's story. The monument featured a bronze sculpture of Angela standing tall, her hand extended toward a rising phoenix, a symbol of rebirth and transformation. Around her were figures representing the community, a child holding a protest sign, an elder raising their fist, and a firefighter stepping forward with an open hand. As Angela stood before the crowd to speak, she was overwhelmed with emotion. This monument isn't just for me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's for all of us. For every person who said, enough. For every voice that refused to be silenced. This is our legacy, a reminder that justice isn't a destination. It's a journey. And as long as we walk it together, we will keep moving forward. A legacy solidified. Years passed, but Angela's influence continued to grow. Her nonprofit, the Angela Carter Justice Initiative, expanded internationally, tackling issues of inequality and abuse in public services around the world. Her memoir, From the Ashes We Rise, became required reading in schools, inspiring students to explore issues of justice and activism. Angela herself remained deeply involved, though she shifted her focus to mentoring young leaders. She often reminded them that the fight for justice wasn't about individual heroics but collective action. Change doesn't come from one person, she told a group of college students. It comes from all of us, standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to give up. A final reflection. As Angela neared her later years, she found solace in the quieter moments, walking through her neighborhood, visiting the community center, and watching children play near the monument that bore her likeness. One evening, a young girl approached her with a notebook, her eyes wide with curiosity. Miss Angela, the girl said shyly, how did you know you could change the world? Angela smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. I didn't, she admitted. I just knew I couldn't stay silent. And sometimes, that's enough to start something bigger than yourself. The girl beamed, running back to her family with a newfound sense of purpose. Angela watched her go, a soft smile on her face. She knew the fight for justice would never truly end, but she also knew it was in good hands. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Angela felt a deep sense of peace. She had stood in the fire, and from it, she had helped forge a brighter future.